Okay, so get this. It sounds like the start of a bad joke, right? A communist country walks into a capitalist bank and asks for advice. But this isn't a joke. It's actually one of the most consequential and, frankly, surprising partnerships of the entire 20th century. This is the incredible story of how the World Bank, literally the cornerstone of global capitalism, taught communist China how to get rich. Now, before we get into the how, you really have to appreciate just how wild this whole story is. The scale of China's transformation, I mean, people call it an economic miracle, but honestly, that word barely does it justice. I mean, just look at these numbers. It's just staggering. Back in 1978, China's GDP per capita was a tiny $156. To put that in perspective, they were poorer than Zambia, poorer than Senegal. Fast forward to today, and they're the world's second biggest economy. And along the way, they lifted 850 million people out of poverty. The World Bank itself said it was the fastest economic expansion ever in history. So that's the what. But the how, that's the real mystery here, isn't it? How on earth did a capitalist institution like the World Bank end up teaching communist China how to get rich? How did these two, who were supposed to be ideological enemies, team up to basically rewrite the global economic playbook? Well, the answer, like a lot of things in history, starts with pure desperation. You see, to understand why China would ever open its doors to an organization it used to call an enemy, you have to stop thinking of them as the powerhouse they are today. You have to picture a nation that was basically on the brink of total collapse. So it's the late 70s. China is just crawling out of the absolute chaos of the Cultural Revolution. The economy is a mess. Their factories are running on tech from the 50s. For regular people, life is just a struggle. Everything from food to clothes was strictly rationed. And for the Communist Party, this was way more than just an economic problem. This was an existential threat. If they couldn't deliver a better life for their people, they were done. The old way just wasn't working anymore. The guy who had to figure out a new way forward was Deng Xiaoping. And he was a pragmatist through and through. He came out with this legendary quote. You've probably heard it. He said, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." What he was really saying was, I don't care about ideology anymore. I care about results. If capitalist ideas, the white cat, could make China prosperous, then heck yeah, they were going to use them. But okay, deciding you want to get rich is the easy part. How do you actually do it? Deng had another famous saying for this. He called their strategy crossing the river by feeling the stones. It's a great image, right? They knew they needed to get to the other side, to a modern economy, but there was no map, no bridge. They were going in blind, one step at a time. And for that, they really needed a guide. And that's what leads them to do something pretty unthinkable. In 1980, China formally joins the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And this decision sets the stage for one of the most important and frankly bizarre meetings of the entire century. So picture this, Beijing's Great Hall of the People. Deng Xiaoping sits down with Robert McNamara. He's the president of the World Bank, a guy who is basically the definition of the Western capitalist establishment. And Deng doesn't beat around the bush. He says, look, we're poor, we've lost touch with the world, but then he says something really crucial. Ideas will matter more than capital. See, China wasn't just looking for a handout. It was looking for a textbook. It was looking for a teacher. And let's be clear, this wasn't some act of charity. Not at all. This was a deal that worked for both sides. For China, it was like hiring the world's most expensive consultant to help them modernize, fast. But for the World Bank, oh, this was the ultimate prize. It was a chance to test their economic theories on a nation of 1 billion people. It was the ultimate test case. The teacher, in a way, needed the student just as much as the student needed the teacher. So the deal is made, and class is officially in session. The World Bank basically puts together an entire economic curriculum for the whole country, and it rolled out in 3 main phases. Okay, so what were these phases? First up, you've got the diagnosis. This is where the bank's experts come in and do a deep dive, a full physical on China's economy. Then you have the laboratory, where they set up these little controlled experiments to try out new ideas. And finally, the advanced course, where they get into the really complex, next-level stuff. So that first step, the diagnosis, came in this huge report in 1981. And for the first time, China got a totally objective, data-backed look at itself. And the results were pretty brutal. The big, flashing red light problem? Inefficiency. Just mind-blowing inefficiency. Get this one stat. Chinese factories were using 3 times more energy to produce $1 of value compared to other developing countries. The whole system was just bleeding waste. Okay, so after the diagnosis, it's time for the lab experiments. China couldn't just change the whole country overnight. That would be chaos. So instead, they set up these special economic zones. Think of them as little bubbles of capitalism. The most famous one was Shenzhen. Back then, it was just a quiet little fishing village. They turned it into a full-on capitalist playground. And the results? They weren't just good, they were explosive. While the rest of China was growing at a crazy fast 10% a year, Shenzhen was growing at an average of 58% a year. The experiment, to put it mildly, was a massive success. All right, by the mid-80s, the basics were covered. China was ready by the advanced stuff. A second big report came out, and this one tackled the really tricky issues. How do you make giant state-owned companies actually compete? How do you manage public money like a professional? And, this is super important, how do you create social policies to deal with the fact that some people are going to get way richer than others? The World Bank wasn't just teaching Economics 101 anymore. This was the masterclass in running a complex modern economy. And the impact of all this learning? It was absolutely revolutionary. It didn't just change China, it changed the entire world. But graduating from a poor nation to a global power, well, that came with a very, very steep price. But first, let's talk about the good stuff, and this is the most important part of the entire story. Between the early 80s and the 2010s, China lifted almost 850 million people out of extreme poverty. Let that sink in. That one country was responsible for nearly 3/4 of the entire world's poverty reduction in that time. It's, without a doubt, the greatest anti-poverty success story in all of human history. And as China's economy grew, so did its status inside the World Bank. I mean, look at this timeline. In 1981, they're getting money from the Fund for the World's Poorest Nations. By 2007, they're not taking money, they're giving money to that same fund. And just a few years later, by 2010, they're the bank's third largest shareholder. The student didn't just graduate, they basically took over the school board. But, and this is a huge but, that relentless drive for growth left a trail of destruction. Environmentally, it was a disaster. We're talking toxic air in the cities, rivers so polluted you couldn't use them, soil laced with heavy metals. And socially, yeah, a lot of people got richer, but the gap between the rich and the poor exploded. That old socialist safety net, the iron rice bowl, got smashed, creating this massive divide between the booming cities and the countryside that got left behind. And all of this leads us to one final really important question. The World Bank has given its advice all over the world. And in a lot of places, it's been heavily criticized for failing, for making things worse. So why? Why did it work so incredibly well in China? What was the secret ingredient? Well, the difference really pops when you put China side by side with other countries. You know, the typical critique, especially in Africa and Latin America, is that the bank's policies were forced onto countries that were in the middle of a debt crisis. They had no choice. But China? China was completely different. It was a massive, powerful, sovereign country that was always in the driver's seat. It wasn't a patient being forced to take nasty medicine. It was a client choosing which advice to take and which to leave. That secret ingredient, the one thing that made all the difference, really comes down to one simple but powerful word: agency. Agency is just the ability to make your own choices. And China had it in spades. They had the power and the stability to act independently. They invited the World Bank to the party, they listened to the advice, but at the end of the day, they were the ones who decided how to run their own transformation. It was a partnership, not a dependency. So where does that leave us? This whole story of China and the World Bank is just, it's a one-of-a-kind thing in history, right? A perfect storm of a country desperate for new ideas and an institution dying to test them out. But maybe the real lesson here, the thing to take away, is this. A teacher's advice, no matter how great, only really works when the student is powerful enough to take that lesson and make it their own.